This is Mr. B reads J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, and we're going to start with the incredible work of The Fellowship of the Ring, arguably one of the best books ever written. This story series is aimed at our older children in years 4, 5 and 6, and we're going to enjoy listening with it to the incredible soundtrack from the films, the music of Howard Shore. So sit back and enjoy the wonderful work and music of Lord of the Rings. J.R.R. Tolkien's The Fellowship of the Ring, Chapter 3, Three is Company. It was some months later that Frodo found himself making his final preparations to leave the Shire. Gandalf had gone ahead into the wilderness to find out what was afoot, but had promised to return as soon as he could, or else send word. He had made Frodo vow to leave secretly, which had required more time to prepare for. As a cover story, Frodo had arranged to sell Bag End, and move to a small house in Buckland to be near his old relations. Beyond that, he had had little thought as to where he might actually go, a matter that he had raised with Gandalf at their last meeting, when Gandalf had told him to be careful. "I am getting very anxious," Gandalf had said. "In the meanwhile, do take care, and don't let out any hint of where you are going, and see that Sam Gamgee does not talk. If he does, I really shall turn him into a toad." "As for where I am going," Frodo had replied, "it will be very difficult to give that away, for I have no clear idea myself yet." "Don't be absurd," Gandalf had said. "I'm not warning you against leaving an address at the post office, but you are leaving the Shire, and that should not be known until you are far away, and you must go, or at least set out either north, south, west or east, and the direction should certainly not be known." "I have been so taken up with the thoughts of leaving Bag End and of saying farewell," Frodo had replied, "that I have never even considered the direction. For where am I to go, and by what shall I steer? What is to be my quest? Bilbo went to find a treasure there and back again, but I go to lose one, and not return as far as I can see." "But you cannot see very far," Gandalf had said. "Neither can I. It may be your task to find the cracks of doom, but that quest might be for others. I do not know. At any rate, you are not ready for that long road yet." "No, indeed," Frodo had said. "But in the meantime, what course am I to take?" "Towards danger, but not too rashly, not too straight," answered the wizard. "If you want my advice, make for Rivendell. That journey should not prove too perilous, though the road is less easy than it was, and it will grow worse as the year fails." "Rivendell," said Frodo. "Very good. I will go east, and I will make for Rivendell. I will take Sam to visit the elves. He will be delighted." He spoke lightly, but his heart was moved suddenly with a desire to see the house of Elrond half-elven, and breathe the air of that deep valley where many of the fair folk still dwelt in peace. And so it had been decided. Frodo and Sam would set out upon the path towards Rivendell. Finally, all the preparations had been made, and it was a beautiful sunny afternoon when they were busy packing the final cart with the remainder of the luggage for the house at Buckland. Merry took charge of this and drove off with Fredegar Bolger. "Someone must get there and warm the house before you arrive," said Merry. "Well, we'll see you later, the day after tomorrow, if you don't go to sleep on the way." That left just Pippin behind with Frodo and Sam. Frodo was restless and anxious, listening in vain for a sound of Gandalf. He decided to wait just a little while longer. After that, if Gandalf wanted him urgently, he would go to Crickhollow, and might even get there first, for Frodo was going on foot. His plan, for pleasure and a last look at the Shire as much as any other reason, was to walk from Hobbiton to Bucklebury Ferry, taking it fairly easy on the way. "I shall get myself a bit into training too," he said, looking at himself in a dusty mirror in the half-empty hall. He had not done any strenuous walking for a long time, and his reflection looked a little bit flabby, he thought. He took tea with Pippin and Sam in the kitchen. It had been officially announced that Sam was coming to Buckland to do for Mr. Frodo and look after this bit of garden, an arrangement that was approved of by his gaffer. "Our last meal at Bag End," said Frodo, pushing back his chair. They then all gathered their things, shouldered their packs, and stepped forward across the porch. Frodo shut and locked the round door behind them and gave the key to Sam. "Run down with this to your home, Sam," he said. "Then cut along the row and meet us as quick as you can at the gate in the lane beyond the meadows. We are not coming through the village tonight. Too many ears pricking and eyes prying." Sam ran off at full speed. "Well now, we're off at last," said Frodo. They shouldered their packs and took up their sticks, and walked around the corner to the west side of Bag End. "Goodbye," said Frodo, looking at the dark blank windows. He waved his hand and then hurried after Peregrine down the garden path. They jumped over the low place in the hedge at the bottom and took to the fields, passing into the darkness like a rustle in the grasses. At the bottom of the hill, on its western side, they came to the gate opening onto a narrow lane. There they halted and adjusted the straps of their packs. Presently Sam appeared, trotting quickly and breathing hard. His heavy pack was hoisted high on his shoulders, and he had put on his head a tall, shapeless felt bag, which he called a hat. In the gloom, he looked very much like a dwarf. I'm sure you'll give me all the heaviest stuff, said Frodo. I pity snails and all that carry their homes on their backs. I could take a lot more yet, sir. My packet is quite light, said Sam, stoutly and untruthfully. No you don't, Sam, said Pippin. It's good for him. He's got nothing except what he ordered us to pack. He's been slack lately, and he'll feel the weight less when he's walked off some of his own. Be kind to a poor old hobbit, laughed Frodo. I shall be as thin as a willow wand, I'm sure, before I get to Buckland. But I was talking nonsense. I suspect you've taken more than your share, Sam, and I shall look into it at our next packing. He picked up his stick again. Well, we all like walking in the dark, he said, so let's put some miles behind us before bed. For a short way they followed the lane westwards. Then leaving it, they turned left and took quietly to the fields again. They went in single file along hedgerows and the borders of coppices, and night fell dark about them. In their dark cloaks they were as invisible as if they had all had magic rings. Since they were all hobbits and were trying to be silent, they made no noise. Even the wild things in the fields and woods hardly noticed their passing. After some time they crossed the water west of Hobbiton by a narrow plank bridge. The stream there was no more than a winding black ribbon bordered with leaning alder trees. A mile or two further south they hastily crossed the great road from the Brandywine Bridge. They were now in the Tookland, and bending southeastwards they made for the Green Hill country. As they began to climb its first slopes, they looked back and saw the lamps in Hobbiton far off twinkling in the gentle valley of the water. Soon it disappeared in the folds of the darkened land, and was followed by Bywater beside its grey pool. When the light of the last farm was far behind, peeping among the trees, Frodo turned and waved a hand in farewell. I wonder if I shall ever look down into that valley again, he said quietly. When they had walked for about 3 hours they rested. The night was clear, cool and starry, but smoke-like wisps of mist were creeping up the hillsides from the streams and deep meadows. Thin clad birches swaying in a light wind above their heads made a black net against the pale sky. They ate a very frugal supper, for hobbits, and then went on again. Soon they struck a narrow road that went rolling up and down, fading grey into the darkness ahead. The road to Woodhall and Stock and the Buckleberry Ferry. It climbed away from the main road in the water valley and wound over the skirts of the green hills towards Woody End, a wild corner of the East Farthing. After a while they plunged into a deeply cloven track between tall trees that rustled their dry leaves in the night. It was very dark now. At first they talked, or hummed a tune softly together, being now far away from inquisitive ears. Then they marched on in silence, and Pippin began to lag behind. At last, as they began to climb a steep slope, he stopped and yawned. I'm so sleepy, he said, that soon I shall fall down on the road. Are you going to sleep on your legs? It's nearly midnight. I thought you liked walking in the dark, said Frodo, but there is no great hurry. Merry expects us some time the day after tomorrow, but that leaves us nearly 2 days more. We'll halt at the first likely spot. The wind's in the west, said Sam. If we get on the other side of this hill, we shall find a spot that's sheltered and snug enough, sir. There is a dry firwood just ahead, if I remember rightly. Sam knew the land well, within 20 miles of Hobbiton, but that was the limit of his geography. Just over the top of the hill, they came on the patch of firwood that Sam had mentioned. Leaving the road, they went into the deep, resin-scented darkness of the trees, and gathered dead sticks and cones to make a fire. Soon they had a merry crackle of flame at the foot of a large fir tree, and they sat round it for a while, until they began to nod off. Then, each in an angle of the great tree's roots, they curled up in their cloaks and blankets, and were soon fast asleep. They set no watch. Even Frodo feared no danger yet, for they were still in the heart of the Shire. A few creatures came and looked at them when the fire had died away. A fox passing through the wood on business of his own stopped several minutes and sniffed. Hobbits, he thought. Well, what next? I have heard of strange doings in this land, but I have seldom heard of a hobbit sleeping out of his doors under a tree. 3 of them. There's something mighty queer about this. He was quite right, of course, but he never found out any more about it. The morning came, pale and clammy. Frodo woke up first and found that a tree root had made a hole in his back, and that his neck was stiff. Walking for pleasure, why didn't I drive, he thought, as he usually did at the beginning of an expedition. And all my beautiful feather beds are sold to the Saxville Bagginses. These tree roots would do them good. He stretched. Wake up, hobbits, he cried. It's a beautiful morning. What's beautiful about it, said Pippin, peering over the edge of his blanket with one eye. Sam, get breakfast ready for 9:30. Have you got the bathwater hot? Sam jumped up, looking rather bleary. No, sir, I haven't, sir, he said. Frodo stripped the blankets from Pippin and rolled him over, and then walked off to the edge of the wood. Away eastward the sun was rising red out of the mists that lay thick on the world. Touched with gold and red, the autumn trees seemed to be sailing rootlessly in a shadowy sea. A little below him to the left, the road ran down steeply into a hollow and disappeared. When he returned, Sam and Pippin had got a good fire going. Water, shouted Pippin. Where's the water? I don't keep water in my pocket, said Frodo. "We thought you had gone to find some," said Pippin, busy setting out the food and the cups. "You had better go now." "You can come too," said Frodo, "and bring all the water bottles. There was a stream at the foot of the hill." They filled their bottles and the small camping kettle at a little fall where the water fell a few feet over an outcrop of grey stone. It was icy cold, and they spluttered and puffed as they bathed their faces and hands. When their breakfast was over and their packs all trussed up again, it was after 10 o'clock, and the day was beginning to turn fine and hot. They went down the slope and across the stream, where it dived under the road, and up the next slope, and up and down another shoulder of the hills. And by that time their cloaks, blankets, water, food, and other gear already seemed a heavy burden. The day's march promised to be warm and tiring work. After some miles, however, the road ceased to roll up and down. It climbed at the top of a steep bank in a weary, zigzagging sort of way, and then they prepared to go down for the last time. In front of them they saw the lower lands dotted with small clumps of trees that melted away in the distance to a brown woodland haze. They were looking across the woody end towards the Brandywine River at last. The road wound away before them like a piece of string. "The road goes on forever," said Pippin, "but I can't do without a rest. It is time for lunch." He sat down on the bank at the side of the road and looked away east into the haze, beyond which lay the river, and the end of the shire in which he had spent all of his life. Sam stood by him. His round eyes were wide open, for he was looking across lands he had never seen before and looking at a new horizon. "Do elves live in these woods?" he asked. "Not that I ever heard," said Pippin. Frodo was silent. He too was gazing eastward along the road, as if he had never seen it before. Suddenly he spoke, aloud but as if to himself, saying slowly, "The road goes ever on and on, down from the door where it began. Now far ahead the road has gone, and I must follow, if I can, pursuing it with wary feet, until it joins some larger way, where many paths and errands meet, and whither then I cannot say." "That sounds like a bit of old Bilbo's rhyming," said Pippin. "Or is it one of your imitations? It does not sound altogether encouraging." "I don't know," said Frodo. "It came to me then, as if I was making it up, but I may have heard it long ago. Certainly it reminds me very much of Bilbo in the last years before he went away. He used often to say there was only one road, though it was like a river. Its springs were at every doorstep, and every path was its tributary. 'It's a dangerous business, Frodo, going out of your door,' he used to say. 'You step into the road, and if you don't keep your feet, there's no knowing where you might be swept off to. Do you realise that this is the very path that goes through Mirkwood, and that if you let it, it might take you to the lonely mountains, or even further, to worse places?' He used to say that on the path outside the front door at Bag End, especially after he had been out for a long walk." "Well, the road won't sweep me anywhere for an hour at least," said Pippin, and slinging his pack. The others followed his example, putting their backs against the bank and their legs onto the road. After a rest they had a good lunch, and then some more rest. The sun was beginning to get low, and the light of afternoon was on the land, and they went down the hill. So far they had not met a soul on the road. This way was not much used, being hardly fit for carts, and there was little traffic to the woody end. They had been jogging along now for an hour or more, when Sam stopped a moment, as if listening. They were now on ground level, and the road, after much winding, lay straight ahead, through grasslands sprinkled with tall trees, outliers of the approaching woods. "I can hear a pony or a horse coming along the road behind," said Sam. They looked back, but the turning of the road prevented them from seeing far. "I wonder if it's Gandalf coming to meet us," said Frodo. But even as he said it, he had a feeling that it was not so, and a sudden desire to hide from the view of the rider came over him. "It may not matter much," he said apologetically, "but I'd rather not be seen on the road by anyone. I am sick of my doings being noticed and discussed, and if it is Gandalf," he said as an afterthought, "we can give him a little surprise. To pay him back for being so late. Let's get out of sight." The other two ran quickly to the left and down into a little hollow not far from the road. There they lay flat. Frodo hesitated for a second. Curiosity, or some other feeling, was struggling with his desire to hide. The sound of hoofs drew nearer. Just in time, he threw himself down in a patch of long grass, behind a tree that overshadowed the road. Then he lifted his head and peered cautiously above one of the great roots. Round the corner came a black horse, no hobbit pony, but a full-sized horse, and on it sat a large man who seemed to crouch in the saddle, wrapped in a great black cloak and hood, so that only his boots in the high stirrups showed below. His face was shadowed and invisible. When it reached the tree and was level with Frodo, the horse stopped. The riding figure sat quite still with its head bowed as if listening. From inside the hood came a noise as of someone sniffing to catch an elusive scent. The head turned from side to side of the road. A sudden, unreasoning fear of discovery laid hold of Frodo, and he thought of his ring. He hardly dared to breathe, and yet the desire to get it out of his pocket became so strong that he began slowly to move his hand. He felt that he only had to slip it on, and then he would be safe. The advice of Gandalf seemed absurd. Bilbo had used the ring. And I am still in the Shire, he thought, as his hand touched the chain on which it hung. At that moment the rider sat up and shook the reins. The horse stepped forward, walking slowly at first, and then breaking into a quick trot. Frodo crawled to the edge of the road and watched the rider until he dwindled into the distance. He could not be quite sure, but it seemed to him that suddenly, before it passed out of sight, the horse turned aside and went into the trees on the right. "Well, I call that very queer, and indeed disturbing," said Frodo to himself, and he walked towards his companions. Pippin and Sam had remained flat in the grass and had seen nothing, so Frodo described the rider and his strange behaviour. "I can't say why, but I felt certain that he was looking or smelling for me, and also I felt certain that I did not want him to discover me. I've never seen or felt anything like that in the Shire before." "But what has one of the big people got to do with us?" said Pippin. "And what is he doing in this part of the world?" "There are some men about," said Frodo, "down in the South Farthing. They have had trouble with big people, I believe, but I've never heard of anything like this rider. I wonder where he comes from." "Begging your pardon," put in Sam suddenly, "it's from Hobbiton that this here Black Rider comes, unless there's more than one, and I know where he's going to." "What do you mean?" said Frodo sharply, looking at him in astonishment. "Why didn't you speak up before?" "I've only just thought about it, sir. It was like this. When I got back to our hole yesterday with the key, my dad, he says to me, 'Hello, Sam,' he says, 'I thought you were away with Mr. Frodo this morning. There's been a strange customer asking for Mr. Baggins of Bag End, and he's only just gone. I've sent him on to Buckleberry. Not that I like the sound of him. He seemed mighty put out when I told him Mr. Baggins had left his old home for good. Hissed at me, he did. Gave me quite a shudder. 'What sort of a fellow was he?' says I to the gaffer. 'I don't know,' says he, 'but he wasn't a hobbit. He stooped over me. I reckon it was one of the big folk from foreign parts. He spoke funny.' I couldn't stay to hear more, sir, since you were waiting, and I didn't give much heed to it myself. The gaffer was getting old, more than a bit blind, and it must have been dark when this fellow came up the hill and found him taking the air at the end of our row. I hope he hasn't done no harm, sir, nor me." "The gaffer can't be blamed anyway," said Frodo. "As a matter of fact, I heard him talking to a stranger who seemed to be inquiring for me, and I nearly went and asked him who it was. I wish I had, or you had told me about it before. I might have been more careful on the road." "Still, there may be no connection between the rider and the gaffer's stranger," said Pippin. "We left Hobbiton secretly enough. I don't see how he could have followed us." "What about the smelling, sir?" said Sam. "I wish I had waited for Gandalf," Frodo muttered, "but perhaps it would only have made matters worse." "Then you know or guess something about this rider," said Pippin, who had caught the muttered words. "I don't know. I'd rather not guess," said Frodo. "All right, cousin Frodo. You can keep your secret for the present, if you want to be mysterious. In the meanwhile, what are we going to do? I should like a bit of supper, but somehow I think we had better move on from here. Your talk of sniffing riders with invisible noses has unsettled me." "Yes, I think we will move on for now," said Frodo, "but not on the road, in case that rider comes back, or another one follows him. We ought to do a good step more today. Buckland is still miles away." The shadows of the trees were long and thin on the grass as they started off again. They now kept a stone's throw to the left of the road, and kept out of sight of it as much as they could. But this hindered them, for the grass was thick and tussocky, and the ground uneven, and the trees began to draw together into thickets. The sun had gone down red behind the hills at their backs, and evening was coming on before they came back to the road at the end of the long level over which it had run straight for some miles. At that point it bent left and went down into the lowlands of the Yale, making for Stock, but a lane branched right, winding through a wood of ancient oak trees on its way to Woodhall. "That's the way for us," said Frodo. Not far from the road meeting, they came to the huge hulk of a tree. It was still alive and had leaves on the small branches that it had put out around the broken stumps of its old fallen limbs, but it was hollow and could be entered by a great crack on the side away from the road. The hobbits crept inside and sat there upon a floor of old leaves and decayed wood. And there, in the safety, away from the road and hidden amongst the trees, they fell asleep into a dark and uneasy slumber.